Geography colloquium of this academic year under the theme of World on Edge. So many thanks to Joel Wainwright and the Speakers Committee for organizing this. Today we're really lucky to have with us Sara Smith from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill Department of Geography. And we know that she's on the same time zone. So yeah, no time zone related difficulties. I would also just like to say very brief. Oh, I'm Darla Monroe, the chair of the Department of Geography. I discovered the other day that I also follow Sara on Twitter. So it's good to see her in a couple of different formats, even if both of them are virtual. Without further ado, I will turn over to our host for a more substantive introduction, DeAndre Smiles, who is now presidential postdoctoral fellow in the Department of History. So thanks. Welcome, Sara.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, allow me to join Darla in welcoming everyone to today's event as part of the OSU Department of Geography's 2020-21 Speaker Series. My name, again, is Dr. DeAndre Smiles. I am a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of History here at OSU. I am also a recent alumnus of the Geography Department, having earned my PhD in the summer of 2020. I am extremely delighted and honored to have the opportunity to introduce a good friend of mine, Dr. Sara Smith. Sara is an associate professor and the director of graduate studies in the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Sara holds a degree in religious studies from Lewis and Clark College, as well as an MA and PhD in geography from the University of Arizona. Sara is a feminist political geographer who is interested in the relationship between territory, bodies, and the everyday. In her research, she seeks to understand how politics and geopolitics are constituted or disrupted through intimate acts of love, friendship, and birth. Sara has worked on these questions in the Ladakh region of India's Jammu and Kashmir state in relation to marriage and family planning. Sara's scholarship and service in the discipline of geography is extensive, and it would take up far more room than I have in this introduction to fully describe. But to give you an idea of the awesome work that Sara is doing, she has published in a wide variety of journals in geography, alongside contributions to geographical manuscripts. She has given a multitude of guest lectures and invited talks, and collaborates with colleagues across a wide section of the discipline on future projects, or on various projects. Sara's first book, Intimate Geopolitics, Love, Territory, and the Future on India's Northern Threshold, was published earlier this year by Rutgers University Press. She has also recently published a really great textbook on political geography. As a personal aside to talk about a little bit about how I know Sara, I met her on a Southwest Airlines flight from Nashville to New Orleans back in 2018 when we were traveling to the AAG annual meeting. Our plane ended up getting delayed for about an hour and a half to do some repairs, so we ended up striking up a conversation, and we've continued to be in conversation and collaboration ever since. Sara is one of the people that I look up to the most in geography, and she is someone who I think has helped push the discipline forward in many ways. Sara, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here, and please allow me to welcome you to Ohio State.
That was way too generous. Now I'm embarrassed. Thank you so much for the generous invitation, and especially to Joel, to Kendra, and then again to DeAndre for that nice introduction. And I'm really glad we met on that flight. And DeAndre didn't say, but I actually feature his work in my political geography book as an up-and-coming geographer who the discipline should pay more attention to. So thank you so much. I'm gonna share my screen. I'm narrating what I'm doing, which I said I wouldn't. There we go. So before I get started, I just wanted to say, I mean, the logical thing to do here would be to talk about my book that DeAndre mentioned, but I like that you're doing this series about World on Edge. So I took a riskier approach, and I'm going to talk about a paper that I just started writing that is co-authored with my colleague, Andrew Curley at the University of Arizona. So this is really early ideas, and as you'll see, I'm just thinking them through. we're working through our thoughts on the topic of what we've been calling the scene, or conceptualizations of time, like the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, and the Plantationocene, that have been proposed in relation to global ecological change and climate change. And this work is driven in part by our desire to read across Indigenous and Black theorizations of history and global environmental change and see what's kind of missing or what needs to be taken into account when we think about global ecological change, especially as it's been talked about as the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene. So again, this is a work that's very, very much in progress with Dr. Andrew Curley, assistant professor at the School of Geography over at the University of Arizona. Before I get into the substance of our talk, I wanted to talk about things I actually know about. So I'm going to start by talking more broadly about my research agenda in relation to temporality. So I've been interested for a long time. Actually, as I started to write this talk, I realized my whole career in the question of how people do tricks with time in order to claim and bound territory. So I've theorized that through this question of intimate geopolitics, generational vertigo, demographic fever dreams, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these. Much of my research has been in the Ladakh region of India and centered on this question of intimate geopolitics, or how intimate choices about love, babies, how you raise your children, how these are caught up in questions of territory. So what does who you will or won't sleep with or marry have to do with the territorial configuration that you find yourself within? And this is often tied to questions around young people. So this is where this idea of generational vertigo comes in. I'm interested in how anxiety and uncertainty about the future of your family, the future of your children, the future of territory, how this leads to a kind of vertigo type politics of uncertainty and anxiety around territory. And then I've also theorized this in relation to demographic fever dreams. I'm going to talk about Anthropocene as apocalypse, and then finally the scene. So I understand geopolitics, or struggles for territory, as being caught up in intimacy. And I mean that in two senses. On the one hand, geopolitics can impinge on our intimate life, what we do with our bodies. On the other hand, it's caught up in intimacy, as it's been theorized by folks like Lisa Lowe and Hazel Carby in relation to imperial intimacies, the ways that even as imperial histories kind of hide the ways that we are connected across oceans, those residues of intimacies are there. So most of my work has been in Ladakh, which is up here. This is an old map. Now Ladakh has Union Territory status as of 2019. And most of my work is ethnographic. So we're going to take I shouldn't say that. We're going to take a turn here where a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be based in literature. But most of my work is deeply ethnographic. I've been working in Ladakh since 1999. And my book is based on a survey of 200 folks, interviews with about 150 folks, as well as collaborative work with photography, in which I'm working with young people. So in my book, I seek to understand lived geopolitical life in Ladakh, which is now a Union territory. So now it's a semi-autonomous region at India's northern border, as you just saw, up in the Himalayas. And the colonial legacy of the British and then partition of India and Pakistan gave territory an embodied life, and also subsumed embodied life into territory over the course of the 20th century. And in especially the 80s and 90s, this led to a movement for autonomy by Ladakhis, mainly Ladakhi Buddhists, in which they made demands for autonomy based on religious identity. And this kind of tore asunder relations of marriage that had bridged the Buddhist and Muslim Ladakhis for centuries. And in the 90s, there was a rapid change here. So at the same time, there came up a pronatal campaign by Ladakhi Buddhists asking women to have more babies with the idea that that would secure an electoral future for Ladakh in which Buddhists would always maintain their majority and be in charge of the local government. So the book kind of looks at these questions around love, marriage, who you have to your dinner party, what school you send your kids to, and it asks, what does it mean to inhabit a geopolitical body? Thinking about bodies as both a place through which we know the world and as having a kind of physics in their relations to one another and as being managed as populations. At the same time, I understood bodies as exceeding their own bounds, and here's where it matters for today's talk, being a vector to the future. So I looked at this through intimacy, intermarriage, reproduction, and youth. And I always like to shout out the cover art for my book, which was made by Cene, and you can find his work on Instagram under Spindle Art. Oops. So this work looks at marriage, who we fall in love with, what happens when you fall in love with the wrong person, and then also time in the sense of how do young people understand their own futures. But the book also touches on this generational vertigo and also questions of youth and the future in the Himalayas. And this is work that I've been collaborating with Dr. Mabel Gergen since for about 10 years. And she's actually given a talk at Ohio State a few years ago, so some of you might remember her. So Mabel was my first PhD student. Now she's working at Vanderbilt. And we've been working with young people, and you see images from a zine that they made with us here. And these are young Ladakhis who grow up in the Himalayas, and then they go to college in big cosmopolitan Indian cities where they're racialized as not really being Indian. So at the same time as they're experiencing like love, pleasure, being wild away from their parents in cities like Delhi and Mumbai, they're also understanding that they're the future of their place, and they're asking themselves what that means, and their parents are also asking this. So they come to think of themselves as a kind of vector to the future. So this work has been, we've interviewed folks and we've done this kind of collaborative making art that you see here to tell stories about how young people imagine expansive futures for themselves that place them in relation, not always to the Indian nation, but also more global imaginaries. Even as they also understand themselves to be a vector to maintain cultural and political agency in their own hometown. So there's questions of like loss of culture, loss of language, loss of religious identity, and who are we going to be in the future? So what you see underlying both of these ethnographic projects is a question: how does anticipation of the future animate our relations to one another? And this is a question that connects to the work that Andrew and I are doing, and also, I would argue, to our contemporary politics. So moving away from my work in Ladakh, I've been following these questions in this country and elsewhere. And one of the ways that I've theorized that is through thinking about demographic fever dreams. Ooh, how about I look at my notes? So during the 2016 US presidential elections, I'm sure I don't have to say that these things are on our mind right now. Racist and territorial rhetoric was used to kind of undermine the potential for class solidarity. It's like elided and obscured material realities, and then focused on a kind of white embodied nationalism centering whiteness at risk, danger at the border, resulting in an election in which we saw these stark correlations between how people are racialized and how they voted. And the phrase demographic fever dream surfaced for me in fall of 2016. So my PhD student, Chris Newbert, who does work on, he's querying the farm crisis in Iowa, looking at whiteness, masculinity, and agricultural policy. So he posted this shirt, "America Needs Lesbian Farmers." And this was, this came out of a random tirade that Rush Limbaugh went on, in which he was saying, that the Obama administration was trying to repopulate the Midwest with lesbian farmers in order to turn red states blue. So Chris and I were mesmerized by this idea that there's like an army of lesbians going to take over the Midwest and it's going to change electoral politics. And I thought of this idea like a fever dream. And I'll explain a little bit about that. So we invited Banu Gokriksal to write with us, and we looked at the idea of demographic fever dreams in India, in Turkey, and here in the US. Once we started thinking about these as demographic fever dreams or vividly specific demographic fantasies, seemingly detached from or wildly exaggerating demographic trends, we started to see them everywhere. So we see them in the kind of white nationalism that we remember in Charlottesville, but we see them in other kind of strange little moments too. So this idea that there's going to be taco trucks on every corner and this is a problem. Trump's obsession with portraying Black and brown men as violent threats to white femininity. And in India, we see this, or I had already been familiar with this idea of love jihad, or the idea that Muslim men are gonna take over India by wooing and seducing Hindu women. So we theorized the work that demographic fantasy plays in the realm of the political, and we looked at 4 specific aspects of demographic fever dreams as a concept. One, this vivid specificity, like the lesbian farmers, that catches the imagination. And then a seeming detachment from demographic data, but a simultaneous obsession with demography. And then finally, gendered representation of masculinity, often with like a majoritarian strong man who's gonna rescue the potentially weak and in need of rescue women. So in the US, that would be white women. So with Carlos Serrano and Pavitra Vasudevan, we also went on to connect these ideas to white supremacy in the form of a fictive national kinship or a fictive white national family, and the way that the preservation of that family, this fictive white family, is premised on the breaking of kinship of Native families, immigrant families, Black and brown folks. So how does this connect to climate? Remember, I'm thinking about this question of how does our anticipation of the future kind of shape our relations to one another and how we think about things? Okay, so I first started thinking about this question with Mabel Gergen, who I mentioned. As you can see, I really like to work and collaborate with folks. I don't like to be in a room by myself. So this was with Mabel Gergen and again, Pavitra Vasudevan. And we wrote this paper, Earth Beyond Repair, where we looked at the potential starting points for the Anthropocene geologic proposals, and then we mapped them onto apocalyptic tropes. So we're thinking about the creation of the Anthropocene as a fundamentally political act. If we consider how the Anthropocene is used to generate urgency, we need to ask what kind of urgency, and urgency for who? And this is following Zoe Todd and Kyle White, who I'll come back to in just a few minutes. We argue that markers used to temporally pin the Anthropocene remind us that the world has been living in an apocalyptic anthropocenic future since the 15th and 16th centuries. It's just that this apocalypse has been uneven. So sometimes we only think of apocalypse when it comes for white people. So we traced sort of the ways that these markers, these were potential markers that folks had suggested as like the Anthropocene could start at this time. We traced them onto these different tropes of disaster kind of narratives and tried to understand the ways that impending ecological disaster has always been figured in really racialized terms, and suggests that the global crisis heralded by the Anthropocene sometimes serves as a proxy for other deep-seated anxieties of racialized others taking over the planet. And Andrew Baldwin has some great work on this. By the way, I actually made a Google Doc bibliography. One of the things that I'm trying to do here is think about other kind of ways of thinking that I think are helpful for us. So I made a bibliography that I can put in the chat at the end. Remind me if I don't do it. All right. So for the rest of the talk, now I'm going to change to the scene. So this is the paper I'm working on with Andrew. And I know I said this before, I promised I wouldn't say it more than twice, but we're just getting our ideas together, and promising to give a talk in a couple months on a new idea is just not the same when there's a pandemic and your child hasn't been to school since February. So just, I appreciate your grace that you're extending to me in this moment as I start to talk about this paper. All right, so Andrew likes to use this slide in his talks, and you'll see why in a minute. So this is this intergovernmental panel on climate change, and it's kind of declaring we're headed for disaster. So what he says about it is that it's calling on lawmakers to reduce carbon emissions, mitigate and prevent the worst impacts of global warming. In order to limit global warming, we need to do rapid, far-reaching changes in all aspects of society. This vision of the world rightly evokes urgency, and we don't dispute the need for urgent changes and the need to act. But in the strive to act, who are the assumed subjects of history? Who is this we? Who is driving the story? And how does this affect colonized people? How does this affect people who are living under the doctrine of discovery? This urgent action could also entail running roughshod over native sovereignty. Even as we absolutely agree on the need for urgent action, we have concerns about unanticipated effects and the universal we used in these kind of statements. Okay. A few months after this statement was released, we both were sitting in a talk. And in this talk, the world was described to us as both a slave ship and as a spaceship. And about this, I wrote a little bit. The white man takes the stage. He's pacing and he's talking about slave ships. He's talking about the genocide of Native people, and he's showing us images of death and displacement, images of the slave ship, of famine, of hunger. He's telling us that the planet is a slave ship. Right now, in this moment, he's the captain of the ship that is this lecture hall. But where is he taking us, and what role do we play in his story? He's talking about his people, white people, and implicating them in this violence, but he also seems unaffected by the grotesque images behind him. Like Kant, like Hegel, like Marx, he's telling us the story of the world. Why in all this culpability and all this blame are white people still driving the story? Why are images of violence only a setting for white redemption in the form of this man telling us a story about how his people, also my people, destroyed the world? Why are Black and Indigenous people depicted as scenery and plot devices, rather than foregrounding the theories and actions through which they have worked to understand our current condition? These two moments, the memo and the academic reading of the planet as a slave ship, in which our situated relations to the figure of enslaved people are erased, time is doing political work in both of these, but the long enduring work of Black and Native people fighting for freedom is erased. What if we were to center the demands that Black and Indigenous people have been making, rather than reconstruct white history and rely on its logic to save the world? In the Combahee River Collective's landmark 1977 statement, they write, "If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression." What if when we approach the Anthropocene, we started from statements like this? In the theorization of the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene, where is liberation? Where is decolonization? What if we centered already existing demands for the land to go back, to redress structural conditions that place Black people in a tight relation to environmental degradation? What if we centered Indigenous demands first? So this is from this piece by Baldwin and Erickson, where they quote Du Bois, "I'm given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen." They say, they pick up this quote and then they say, lurking just beneath the surface of the Anthropocene concept is a racialized narrative about white earthly possession. When we encounter the bounding and claiming of time, and we started talking about this paper, just talking about the idea that we could bound time itself, that not only we bound space by marking out different countries or different continents, but this bounding is also about time. When we encounter the bounding and claiming of time, we have to ask, who's doing tricks with time and what are the unintended or intended side effects? Okay. Capitalocene and Plantationocene center the dominance of capital and colonization as culpable for climate catastrophe, but also center Western history. So Tuck and Gaztambid Fernandez explain one genre of settler replacement in which scholars reoccupy spaces that have been opened up by kind of critiques and responses to racism by then absorbing that knowledge, but displacing the bodies out to the margin. So kind of lightly incorporating a critique of whiteness, but then displacing scholars of color. So we wonder, to what extent do existing scenes recenter Western Europe and engage in a limited and itself bordering way with temporal critiques and imaginaries that are in fact expansive? And I want to do more with Rahul Rao's recent work, Out of Time, here. But we ask, how can we avoid succumbing to an essentially white apocalypse? That is, one that only acknowledges the apocalypse when it comes for white people. And we connect this also to questions around the pandemic. I'm going to skip that a little bit because I don't want to go late. So our discipline has been grappling with how do we think about the time that we're in now? And of course, the way that is often talked about as the Anthropocene, this idea that humans have fundamentally changed the earth, constituting a new geologic era. So the Capitalocene is helpful in that it says, hey, it's not all humans, actually it's capital. So this ties environmental problems to the destructive nature of capitalism. And then in tension with the Anthropocene and Capitalocene, Haraway, Singh, and others have proposed the Plantationocene, pinning the beginnings of a new geologic era on the development and spread of the plantation model of agriculture. And this has some promising aspects, but Janae Davis, Alex Moulton, and some others have written a really interesting critique of this in Geography Compass, arguing that this scholarship has thus far really not really engaged with the materiality of Black life. So why hasn't Black studies and Indigenous scholarship been central to these theorizations? In reference to Black studies, and particularly the work of Hortense Spillers and Sylvia Winter, Wahelia describes this kind of concealment and absence as ethnographic detainment. There's so much in these two words. While the scholarship of Black studies fundamentally addresses the scope of human history, it's often folks are made to speak to their particular experience. So when women of color writers articulate their critiques as a result of and in relation to their identities, the knowledge they produce is often relegated to ethnographic locality. So they don't get to speak on behalf of the scene. So what we wonder is when we're thinking about the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, the Plantationocene, when we're thinking about policy documents like the memo that I showed you a while back, how do we prevent these from being just material and intellectual land grabs? That is, how does policy not just become a way to kind of arrest Native sovereignty? And how does the theorization of these scenes not become a kind of intellectual land grab where, again, white European history is overwritten on top of folks who have already been theorizing this? When the earth and kind of the scope of human history is theorized, why haven't Black studies and Indigenous studies and Black and Native demands been made central? Okay, am I ready for this? Yes, okay, apparently I am. All right, so here's where Andrew is going to talk about Arizona as a dystopia. So Andrew is Dene. He's been working in the Navajo Nation for many years, and he's written about Arizona itself as an already existing dystopia. And then he and Marley Lister have recently published some work on this. And you'll see right away, if you're familiar with Kyle White, it's drawing on this. Specifically, they're looking at the way that coal and water have kind of the infrastructure of coal and water in the settler state of Arizona have accelerated. They've kind of like brought us to this dystopia like very quickly. So his question then is like, Arizona is already a dystopia made by colonial infrastructure. So what do these other kinds of theorizations really have to offer us? And this builds on his work. This is in this bibliography that I'll send y'all on coal in the Navajo Nation. So this builds on this question that Kyle White and also Zoe Todd, who I'll talk about in a bit, have been asking for a long time, saying, when was the apocalypse? So White Potawatomi scholar Kyle White writes, Indigenous people do not always share the same science fiction imaginaries of dystopian or apocalyptic futures when they confront the possibility of climate crisis. And he marshals a range of Indigenous scholarship to describe climate crisis as deja vu, and our present, in the words of Lee Sprague, as what our ancestors would have understood as a dystopian future. So this is the point that Andrew and Marley are building on. He writes, Native Americans have seen the end of their respective worlds, particularly in the separation from land, folks who were driven off the land. He writes, Indians survived the apocalypse. So what do we do to address this ethnographic detainment? Native scholars have been writing about the temporality of climate change, crisis, liberation, and resurgence. And scholarship in Black studies, Native studies, and queer theory has been capacious in its understanding of the relationships between time, our bodies, land, and oceans. What if we work against crisis and scarcity narratives and look to kind of other temporalities? So when we started reading more, looking for these different temporalities, there's so many, I can't really go through them. You don't have time for that. But I'm going to talk mainly about 3, but this is just to give you a sample. So folks have talked about, can we write about the Anthropocene as a blues epistemology? Can we kind of not bound time, but think of like a queer the future as a kind of horizon we don't get to? Can we think about feral futurities and Indian time? That's Billy Ray Belcourt. Can we think of desire as a kind of temporality rather than get stuck in trauma narratives? And then can we think about fugitive temporalities? This is this great book, Fraudage, that just came out. And then Angie Morrill has written in relation to Indigenous erasure and gentrification of Black communities. She's picked up the work of Rememory from Toni Morrison to understand that. So what kind of different, more capacious understandings might we bring to understand our current era? And just 3 ideas that we're working with in the paper. And this is still very fluid. One is the work of Dallas Hunt. So Dallas Hunt, who's Cree of the Swan River First Nation, observes that science fiction generates this sense of crisis, care, concern for environmental sustainability, but he's pointing out that a lot of times Indigenous people aren't even in the future. And he has this great critique of this Mad Max Fury Road film as a totem transfer narrative where Indigenous folks are like disappeared and then white people have kind of hold the future. So he contrasts that with different Indigenous art forms or films engaging with Indigenous themes and the way that they depict the future in relation to Indigenous sovereignty and the kind of white anxiety that this brings up, which is also really, his reading of white anxiety about the future is really effective. So I wish I could say more about that, but I really recommend his work on this. So I've been thinking about questions around the Anthropocene in relation to other kinds of work in Black studies, and in particular the work of Christina Sharp. In the opening to In the Wake, Sharp writes about death and writes about her mother. She writes about a precarity that looked like and felt like winters without heat because there was no money for oil, holes in ceilings, walls, and floors from water damage that we could not afford to repair. She writes about phone calls that relay the death of relatives in precarious circumstances, as well as about a mother who brought beauty into a house in every way that she could, a mother who worked at joy and made livable moments, spaces, and places in the midst of all that was unlivable. So she places the deaths of her relatives in relation to other deaths, placing her own embodied experience of Blackness in relation to the long wake of slavery. And she writes, I want to think and argue for one aspect of Black being in the wake as consciousness. And she goes on with this theorization of life in the wake of slavery. And this is a theorization of time that's really omitted when a white man takes the stage and talks about a planet slave ship. Sharp is relating her own embodied Black life and the deaths of close relatives to many other deaths over time. And she's providing us with a planetary history, one that's more intimate than the planet as slave ship, but one that's also more affecting and more urgent. She asks, what is Black being in the wake of slavery? So in this work, she's asking us to think about living in the wake on a global level in relation to like ongoing migrations, including migrations related to like climate-driven catastrophes. And she's asking us to think in this long term, drawing on Diane Brand and Saidiya Hardman. And as an example of the way she's trying to think about this, she writes about those who ended up in the ocean, about the, like as has been called elsewhere, the mysteries at the bottom of the Atlantic. Even if those Africans who were in the hold, who left something of their prior selves in those ruins as a trace to be discovered, and who passed through the doors of no return, did not survive the holding and the sea, they, like us, are alive in the hydrogen and oxygen and carbon and phosphorus A and iron and sodium and chlorine. So she's asking us then to consider this as residence time, the time of remaining. And I think we have to ask ourselves, who are we to one another in the wake? Where In the Wake begins with Sharp's mother, the preface to Jody Bird's Transit of Empire begins with Bird's father. She writes of her father's life and death. His life had become unlivable through whatever it was that chased him. I always thought his struggle was, in the end, about home, place, and belonging. We Chickasaws lost our country twice, once through removals and then through allotment and creation of the state of Oklahoma. She goes on to describe the Chickasaw as unconquered, unconquerable, and unconquered, and says, yet, there's a difference between recovered and having never lost in the first place that stands in breach for those of us attempting to theorize the legacies of colonialism within Indigenous worlds. For my dad, I think that loss was unmappable, ungrievable, and unapproachable within the constraints of US settler society. So what I'm wondering in this paper is, how do we hold these kinds of understandings of time when we're thinking about the Anthropocene? And I'm getting close to wrapping up now. I think I've gone a little long, sorry about that. So as I said, Kyle White has really helped us most to think through these issues. He writes about current apocalypse as a settler fantasy of unlimited domination and extraction. And he writes in specific terms about white allies, saying that their ancestors, that it's hard for those white folks who, want to be allies to Native people to really grapple with the fact that their ancestors might have delighted in the kind of like success of settler colonialism. He writes, they would have delighted in the idea that their legal orders would not have had to bend or accommodate Indigenous legal orders. Many of the ancestors of today's allies designed the world we live in today to fulfill their fantasies of the future. So White then goes on to think through other kinds of temporalities, like spiraling time, in which ancestors and people in the present and people in the future are kind of together, contemporaneous, and that spiraling time could include narratives of cyclicality, reversal, dreamlike scenarios, simultaneity, counterfactuality, irregular rhythms, ironic cyclicality, slipstream parodies of linear pragmatism and eternality. And also, I think along similar lines, Leanne Simpson writes on dawn and on the future as also being in the present. So this might seem abstract, but these concepts and relationships to time are also political orientation towards temporality. And for White, crucially, this doesn't mean like reifying or fixing Indigenous people or ancestors in time, but placing their politics and their political systems alongside those today to give us an ethical orientation towards questions of policy and environmental management. The meta-narrative of the Capitalocene provides us an unfolding history of violence and a history of global rupture that calls for a response. But we have these other folks, Bird, Sharp, King, Macharia, who are telling us stories about time and power and global rupture and breaking points. The politics of their stories have a different orientation that comes through in the telling. So they're providing us perhaps with a constellation of distinct but also resonant theorizations of time and relations that can enable both a more abundant and cautious approach to thinking about environmental change across time and in relation to catastrophes. Hunt asks, for whom are these futures sustainable? Who's accorded space in the future and who isn't? And again, Tuck and Gaztambide Fernandez tell us that settler replacement is at work in the university when white settler scholars are hired as experts or fulfill roles related to challenges of multiculturalism. And I think that this is parallel here, where we have to take care when we look now to Europe to kind of blame European history and center European capitalism as driving all of history in the wrong directions. We need to just think a little bit about who's speaking for whom and who is getting centered in what ways. Let's see. So we must attend to how we think and theorize the current dystopia in order to avoid allowing both policy and theorization to be literal and theoretical land grabs. And the ways that we anticipate the future are also about our relations to one another, to territory, and to the land. What does that imply for us here? For Black people and Indigenous people, apocalypse already happened. Structures of domination or the wake of the slave ship are contemporary issues that we're living with today. They're front and center, not plot points in a grand narrative of Europe. While Native perspectives often look to past practices to alleviate climate crisis, white policy often lays out technocratic and future-oriented solutions, echoing White's commentary of the when of dystopia. To center Black and Indigenous timescales and temporalities, particularly the history of people and the planet, draws our attention to different kinds of politics and solutions, moves away from ecological modernization or progress of technologies, and draws our attention to the land back movement, to abolition work, to decolonization, and to climate justice. So that's not really a conclusion, but those are some things that we're thinking through. And I just want to say thanks again for having me. And I'm happy to answer any questions about this paper, which, as you saw, work in progress, or my other work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, this is Kendra McSweeney. I'm here following up from DeAndre, who had to leave, and I came in late, so we tag teamed your the emceeing. But welcome, and thank you for that. I'd like to open the floor to the extent possible in a webinar to questions for Sarah. Thank you so much for those really fascinating ideas. Please put your questions in the chat and I will relay them. I don't see any yet. I see, Sarah, you did put in your bibliography? Okay, thank you.
I did. Should I put that in the Q&A?
Good question. This is my first time webinaring. I thought I'd mastered Zooming, but it's not quite the same. So I don't know, but okay. I think that's a good place to start. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, you've got it in the chat. I think that's good. Yeah, that's fine. You can leave it there. Thanks, Joel. So please jump in with your questions, and remember, we're privileging the questions of students. Well, undergrads, grad students, anybody who's non-faculty, because faculty tend to dominate these discussions, so we want to make sure we get other voices. Okay, aha. We are getting a chat that, okay, so Joel will be sending out the bibliography to all the participants if you cannot see it. All right. Well, Sarah, while people are thinking and composing their questions, I don't see any. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, if you see questions. All right. I'm working on a very small screen here. I wanted to say how interesting I found your final points relating to why this stuff matters for policy and the environment. And I was reminded when I was working in the field of resilience and working with Indigenous people, and my question will be to be continued. Do you see the question from Sher Ali? Can you see his question there?
Yeah,
okay.
I see it. Yeah, good. This is such a good question. I mean,
would you mind reading it just to make sure?
Oh, of course. Yeah, sure. Thank you. So my question is related to Ladakh. How do you view the current annexation under Modi, and what are things what are implications for social reproduction, environment, and so on. Yeah, I mean, it's really chaotic, and everybody has so many concerns. So as some of y'all, I don't know how closely everyone follows these events, but what happened is in late summer of last year, a few days after we left India, actually, all of the Kashmir was put under kind of a lockdown, communications were cut, and it was kind of like the deepening and further entrenchment of Indian settler colonialism in the state of Kashmir. So what was happening in Ladakh at that moment? We were really concerned. I mean, we saw the news and we started trying to call our family. My husband is Ladakhi. We started right away trying to call my mother-in-law, trying to call folks, and we got through immediately because Ladakh was not locked down. What had happened was Ladakh was finally getting this thing that they have been asking for a long time, Union territory, right at the moment when sovereignty was being further compromised in Kashmir. And the same day that people were really worried about violence and what the police and military were doing in Srinagar, people were having a party in the streets of Leh because they had gotten Union territory. But immediately this started kind of unraveling with this, there've been all these protections for the state of Jammu and Kashmir as a kind of contingent territory. So outsiders couldn't buy land, you have to have the state subject certificate, and that has really protected Ladakhis from so many things. And all of that is unraveling right now. So folks have been saying now anybody's going to be able to buy land here, and the economic disparity between Ladakh and other places is such that people can just be kind of bought out of their property very, very easily. So what is happening right now is that Ladakhis are trying to get a recognized sixth scheduled tribe status for the territory that would ensure some kind of recognition of them as like having a special status so that outsiders would have limited rights. But it's not at all clear that this is going to happen. And in fact, Modi, was it Modi? No, it was BJP. The BJP party was tweeting like, hey, Ladakh is open, come buy real estate. This happened like 2 days ago. So all the Ladakh social media sites is kind of like awash with concern about this and concern about what the future holds. So that's not really such an answer, just to say is a very chaotic system or moment where things are changing from time to time. And many folks, like we just had the Ladakh Hill Council elections and BJP won a majority, but it was like regionally depending, it was very nuanced. I think I'm talking too much about this one question. I'm sorry, it's on my mind. Anyway, it's very chaotic and folks are really concerned about the environmental impacts, the social impacts, and everything else. There's a lot of concern about what will happen in Ladakh in the next few years. That was a great question, very specific.
Thank you. Other questions? Students, we'd love to hear from you. Hey, Mary.
No, we're not. I mean, I don't know that that's such a, sorry,
So the question,
I
the
would
question
read the
is,
question. Yeah.
the question is, are Sara and Andrew writing at all about the ways that girls and women are represented in the material covered?
Yeah, sorry, Mary, I'm sorry to give such a flippant answer. I mean, most of the folks I've been reading are women actually, but we haven't really done a gendered analysis around it in relation to especially his work. So the work that would be more empirical in this paper is coming from the Navajo Nation. Okay, I'm going to come to that. So Mary further asks, I'm especially interested in how Black and Indigenous representations like Black Girl Magic also carry this through. That's such a good question. Okay, so in relation to that, we haven't like specifically held that out, but in Andrew's larger work, he has actually written about this, especially with Melanie Yazzie and this book that we have. Banuko Crixel, Chris Newbert, Mike Hawkins, and I have this feminist geography book coming out, and Andrew and Melanie Yazzie, who is also Dene, have written this really great chapter in there on the relation between settler colonialism, gender, the dispossession of women's property rights, and the way that settler colonialism has kind of further entrenched patriarchal gender forms. So he has covered that kind of in his larger body of work. And in this work, a lot of the stuff I'm writing on is drawing on like Black feminism, but I have to think more about this Black girl magic question, because I haven't really specifically sat down and been like, now I'm going to do gender. I don't know if that's a good answer because the questions disappear. Okay. In terms of research, what are the challenging and oh my goodness, what aren't the challenges? Okay, so Cher asks, thank you. I wish your family love and solidarity, and I appreciate that. In terms of research, what are the challenges in researching places such as these and so on? I mean, what has become increasingly frustrating for me is that I just don't feel like I can be engaged enough from here. It's not enough to be there in the summer and then be like following, like chatting on WhatsApp or like keeping in touch on like Facebook, social media, like, you know, these conversation websites. Like I always feel like I'm not doing enough for my collaborators. I collaborate there with the Ladakh Arts and Media Organization, who I love. They have great politics and they're always asking me to do kind of more or to stay longer or to do more projects. And being rooted in North Carolina and having an 8-year-old and taking on additional like service work in the department, it's just very hard to feel like I can really be in Ladakh. It's when we go to Ladakh with, again, our 8-year-old daughter, it feels like we need to spend time with family and make her learn the language and hang out with her cousins. And then I'm like sneaking out in the middle of the day while she's distracted to like run up a mountain and try to do some research real quick. So that is like one of the challenges. The other challenges are just the constant ethical dilemmas of always wondering who you're writing for and how. So that actually drove my shift from working on marriage and reproduction to working with college kids, because the work that I have in the book, most of the women who talk to me for the book, they're not going to read my book, and they really did research. They participated because they like me and they think I'm sweet and they wanted to help me out. But then they're not so interested in my analysis. So that's a weird feeling. So now I shifted to working with college students on their experience. And then when I write an article, I can send it to them and say, what do you think about how I wrote about you? What do you think about my analysis? And kind of have a different kind of conversation, which feels much healthier to me. So those ethical challenges, though, never kind of leave us, because then what does that mean to be working with this one really specific segment of folks over there? So in short, it's a disaster, and I'm trying. Okay, oh, sorry, I forgot I should be reading these. So Becky writes, I'm interested in whether thinking from Ladakh is different from thinking from the US settler colonial context. This is such a great question. Does the theory you use to rethink the scene work in Ladakh? Does thinking from Ladakh change how you read Black feminist and Native theory? Yeah, I really love this question. So I wish that my student Pallavi Gupta was here, and because we've been talking a lot about how do you read theory across contexts. So Pallavi is doing work on caste and cleanliness in the Indian railways. And she is using racial capitalism to theorize this. And it works really, really well. So thinking through kinds of the ways that racialization is caught up and inseparable from capitalism, and drawing on Robinson and others who have theorized this really helps us understand the way that caste functions to facilitate the smooth flow of capital and the disenfranchisement of workers. But then we do get into these conversations about to what extent can you use these things across contexts. And she was just in a panel with Frank Wilderson and saying like, hey, can I use Afro-pessimism to theorize caste? And he was kind of like, no, you can't. So they were like, it was like a back and forth trying to think about like when you don't want to say this is like this or this is like that and kind of forget about context. But then at the same time, all of these things were made in relation to empire, which is fundamentally global and interconnected. And this is the point that Lisa Lowe's trying to make. So I do try to read these things kind of across context and then just take care how I do so. I think that thinking from Ladakh changes how I read Black feminist and Native theory, in that I think whenever we work for a long time in a field site, we're thinking about the people we know and the stories we've told us. And then when we read something, we're kind of testing that out. Like, does this help me think through this story this person told me? And I feel like sometimes it does, and then sometimes it doesn't, or sometimes it complicates things. With the settler colonialism, I think this is a conversation me and Mabel still have to keep having and have been having. And Mabel and Andrew are writing a paper together about Indigenous issues in India and in the Navajo Nation. So this is sort of a conversation that a couple of us are having, and I feel like sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So there's ways that settler colonialism as a theoretical framework works quite well in Kashmir and is more complicated in Ladakh. Yes, that came up yesterday, exactly. So in the chat, there's a point of Wilkerson's work, and this is what Wilderson was sort of disagreeing. Why am I talking about this panel yesterday? Anyway, Pallavi, I'll ask her to look at it, but she's kind of theorizing it in a different way, like through Black feminism and also through kind of different sorts of like racial capitalism, and she hasn't taken it in that direction. But I think that is a good question. This is really helpful. I love these questions.
And you're navigating very well. Thank you for keeping up with the chat too.
I don't know about that. I didn't say I am a little scattered today because it was a strange day where we had a active shooter incident on campus, or maybe there wasn't. We're not really sure what happened. So I'm not totally myself. So I apologize if I seem a little scatterbrained. It's been a really strange day.
Oh. It seems every day offers something strange. I was
Yes.
I was on a workshop today where half of the participants had their power knocked out by the hurricane. So it's like, well, let me ask a question, and I apologize if you came in, perhaps if this was covered at the beginning of your talk, but the combination of your work on demographic fever dreams and now your interest in sort of this apocalyptic temporality seems tailor-made for thinking through the pandemic, particularly as a demographic event that would have once appeared fever dream-esque, but is now, you know, very much reality, and it is affecting populations differently, of course. But for many peoples, particularly Indigenous peoples, pandemic has always been a handmaiden of their experience. So the anxiety with which many of us are contemplating death via pandemic is something that is very familiar, tragically familiar to other populations. I'm just wondering how the pandemic moment has helped you to maybe allied the two elements of your work.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and that is something. So let's see, how do I? So one of the things I've been working on that I didn't mention was with Pavitra Vasudevan, we've been trying to think through domestic geopolitics, or sort of the ways that kind of internal colonization of Black and Indigenous people. If I had longer, I could kind of complicate that idea of internal colonization, because there's always colonization. It's a settler colonial state. So Pavitra and I have.
Take your time. Time-wise, we have.
Okay.
Yeah. Don't feel rushed.
Okay. So Pavitra and I, we wanted to think through domestic forms of geopolitics, and in particular, the ways that Black people come to experience the United States as an imperial power. So we looked at this she's been doing work in Baden, North Carolina, at the site of an aluminum processing plant, and looking at the ways that Black folks were exposed to toxic waste. And she has really great work out on that, especially her paper, Intimate Inventory and Antipode. So together, we thought through that site in relation to events in Flint, Michigan. And we wanted to think through these as a form of domestic geopolitics in two senses. One sense domestic in terms of internal within the state, the other sense domestic in terms of within the home. So the field of domestic work and the way that, in particular, in both these cases, in Flint and in Baden, it's often Black women doing domestic work and also doing the work of care and kinship that enables Black folks to survive this onslaught of different forms of violence. So then we're also thinking about those kinds of labor as a kind of geopolitics of survival. So the way that in the face of imperial onslaught, folks survive through different forms of wake work on the one hand. So we lay out different kinds of labor. One kind of labor is revolutionary mothering. So like a kind of parenting that is not kinship based, but ensuring the survival of young people in the community into the future as a form of refusal of racist death dealing practices. So we look at that in Baden in the terms of like the kind of organizing that mainly women did. And also similarly in Flint, Michigan, where folks found out their kids were at risk and they didn't just look out for their kids, they looked out for everyone's kids. They're like driving water around town, raising money to get water filters, doing all of this work to ensure the survival of mainly Black kids, kids of color, etc. So we're looking at that as a different form of geopolitics where you're rendered disposable and you refuse to be disposed of. So we looked at that as revolutionary mothering, also as wake work, which is drawing, of course, on Christina Sharp and thinking about the ways that people refuse to let deaths go unmarked. And then thirdly, we looked at it as a kind of labor of expertise where people have to develop environmental expertise, expertise around the law and how you can fight abuses and environmental justice. So like a labor of expertise, revolutionary mothering, and then wake work. So when the pandemic started, we started seeing these same kinds of things everywhere. We were thinking all this summer about the pandemic in relation to these ideas that we had already been thinking through. And then, of course, we saw the protests following the deaths of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, and the kind of rise in conversation about abolition work that had already been happening. And then we were thinking about how we see these different kinds of work too, how this is a kind of wake work of refusing for death to be made meaningless and a kind of like insistence that somebody's death will be made meaningful, will be used to save other people's lives. So then we started thinking about like, how does this domestic geopolitics kind of play out in relation to the pandemic and also these conversations we're having around abolition. And we've been having a couple conversations with both Danielle Purifoy, my wonderful new colleague at UNC Chapel Hill, and with Andrew. We've had these couple conversations about, can the four of us think this through in relation to both Black folks experiencing pandemic and fighting for abolition, and also in relation to the way that the pandemic has affected, for instance, the Navajo Nation, where Andrew has already done interviews and has incorporated work into his most recent article, thinking about the way that it's colonial infrastructure that creates the pandemic disaster on the Navajo Nation. It's not like it doesn't come out of nowhere. But in fact, it's this colonial infrastructure that lays the groundwork for people to not have running water when they're faced with a pandemic. That was a really long-winded answer. You said I had time, so I really was like, went for it. Like.
Thank you. I'm glad you did. That was great. Any other questions? Let's see. Give people a chance here. I want to return to an observation I started with, which was the importance of recognizing these differences in time. I was introduced to that concept in a very sobering way. I was working in an Indigenous community in Honduras, eager to show what sort of resilience resources the community had and how they'd proven so resilient to Hurricane Mitch. And I was saying, climate change and how have things changed. And asking all about change with a very clear assumption that the sort of changes I was talking about were linear and clear and shared by everyone. And I wasn't getting anywhere, and it became very clear that most people did not subscribe to my view of linear time, and this idea of some sort of change towards an end that is chaotic and full of climate change made no sense, did not resonate in any way. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just anchor time with some old photographs, and I'll say, well, comparing to this time, what is the present like? So I'll sort of tether my view of time to some images that should inspire more alignment in how we think of time. And that was a disaster because what I was then told was, well, some of these pictures are from a good time and others of these pictures are from a bad time. They were all taken in 1935 by a Smithsonian expedition, but they were parsed completely differently. And one was spoken about in terms of a time of catastrophe and death, even though it was contemporaneous with, in my view, with another time, it was considered completely separate from a time that had been lived by ancestors of some of the people I was speaking with. So really, how can we possibly move forward with policies? You mentioned policy and environmental management ideas that are predicated on an extremely Western notion of time, with communities on the front lines of climate change, if their views of time and change are so fundamentally different. Without, we must challenge how we think about these things.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. And also, I mean, I forgot to say at the outset that your work was so helpful to me in my dissertation. I forgot to say that. I was working on my dissertation and Paul Robbins was like, you have to read this. And it was so helpful. So I should have thanked you for that when I started talking about my work. Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. I mean, and that is something I write about a little bit in the book, not in relation to climate at all, but just in the relation to not even specifically maybe cultural locations, but sort of to how we tell stories using time. It gets really complicated really quickly. And one of the things I think about in my book is this time when I did this really long interview with this woman who I knew quite well. And she told me about her marriage, and she told me about how she saw one guy in the market and she thought he was cute and she married him and it didn't work out and they got divorced, and she saw this other guy and her friend set her up with him and she married him and they're still married and like happily so. And it's like now she's in her 60s. She was in her 50s and she's in her 60s now. And then it's like half an hour later, we've had tea and snacks and we're still having the interview. And she's like, young people these days getting divorced, getting remarried, they just see somebody and think they're cute. And I'm just like, what's happening with time right now? Like, it's like half an hour ago, this was you. Now you're saying it's teenagers because they have mobile phones. So I feel like we all do these different kinds of things with time, and we're all doing it in these different ways. So that's one of my questions, is kind of how do we use time for different kind of political ends to tell the story that we want to tell, and like what happens, like what's the implications of that? Because we do that too. And then also there's a way that when I talk to Buddhists and Muslims, they're kind of feel like it's not actions they're taking, but it's like time is happening to us. So like we're in this Hindu nationalist country. How things happen is by pitting religious communities against one another. So maybe my best friend growing up was Muslim, but I'm in this time where this is how things happen. And it's kind of like time is doing this to us and we're sort of helpless in front of this onslaught of time. So I feel like there's these different ways that time operates, and I just kind of am attuned maybe to like think through how and why that's happening and what are the implications, because sometimes it's counterintuitive or it's not clear, like what are a good politics of time? Like it's not like that really. It's like how's it being deployed in those different moments?
Yeah. Well, thank you. It looks like, speaking of time, we have 15 minutes left, but it's also Friday afternoon, and I understand that for many people it may been a long week, especially those who are teaching or frankly learning online. Yeah.
All of us, really.
Yeah. Yep. My kids asked if they could have some money to go out, and oh, we have another question. I'll skip the anecdote for later. Go for it.
I was waiting to hear what your kids were going to do with the money. Oh my goodness, this is a big question. Any thoughts on how to address race, colonialism, and capitalism? How do we create a system beyond colonialism that prioritizes Indigenous people and disadvantaged populations? Yeah, I mean, I love that question. I think that's what we're interested in. I mean, in terms of thinking this through in relation to questions about like indigeneity and climate change, the subject we talked about here. I mean, that's one of the points that I know is Andrew is thinking about us making in this paper, is that we already have, you know, more demands for Indigenous sovereignty, like demands that folks be allowed to have sovereignty, not be allowed, like the return of sovereignty to Indigenous people in ways where they can decide what happens. So that's one proposition that is out there. So I would say similarly, I think like listening to demands that kind of have already been made instead of coming up with kind of like technocratic solutions. That's one of the things that we're thinking through and reading right now to try to think about, like that's kind of the next step of our project, is we're trying to like, we've read all of this different work on like temporality, and now we're trying to look through like Andrew's thinking about us looking through the Red New Deal and the Green New Deal and thinking about specific policy proposals and like what is and isn't in those documents and kind of what sorts of temporal horizons are there. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's the answer I got. It's a really good question. All these questions were great. I appreciate them, especially on Friday afternoon, the day before Halloween and a few days before the election.
We in fact had our trick-or-treating last night in Columbus, so it wouldn't conflict with any sports events. Any more questions? Don't hesitate. You can even throw up your questions while we're talking. Do not hesitate. You are not interrupting. All right, we'll give time for, just in case someone has a last. What I was going to tell you is that my kids asked for some money so that they could walk 10 minutes to a store called Rocket Fizz to buy candy. And frankly, I don't care what they're doing as long as they're getting outside after 6 hours of sitting in front of screens for their schoolwork nonstop. Anything that gets them outside, here, take the money, buy the candy, do whatever you have to do. It's terrible. It's as long as you get a walk in, get some exercise, breathe some fresh air, and get away from the screen. It's very hard.
Yes.
Yeah.
I completely agree.
Well, thank you so much on behalf of the department. We've been trying to, as you know, schedule you to come and talk for a while, and it's been a real pleasure to finally meet you and talk with you. You've played a big role in DeAndre's formation, so right back at you. Thank you so much for your mentorship from afar, and we wish you the very best for the rest of the semester.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, our pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, bye.